Hauled out of a burning wagon, skin all scorched. A cowboy soothed each burn and gave her a soft day. I keep a tin of salve in my saddlebag. Have for 30 years. My mother put one there when I left her house at 16, and I never stopped carrying one after she passed, just kept buying the same pine tallow kind when I could find it in a trading post. Most men would call that sentiment. I call it knowing what a burn feels like. I was 2 days out of Laramie when I smelled it. Smoke first, that wet greenwood smoke that means something not meant to burn is burning. Then the orange pulse of it over the ridge before I topped out and could see the whole thing laid flat in the draw below. A Conestoga, broadside, the canvas eaten clear through and the bows going like bones in a fire. One wheel spinning slow in the air. The oxen gone, cut loose by something or someone, their tracks heading north in a panic across the hardpan. I put my heels to the mare before I'd thought it through. There was a man in the grass 20 yards from the wagon, dead. I knew it from the way he was laid, not fallen but finished, like a thing set down that won't be picked up again. Shot, not burned. Somebody else had been through here before the fire got big. I didn't stop for him, not because I didn't care, because I heard her. Not screaming. Something worse than screaming, a low, pressing sound, like a person spending the last of what they have. I found her half under the wagon's front axle where she'd crawled or been thrown, one arm crooked over her face, the hem of her dress still smoking at the ankle. I got hold of her under both arms and pulled her clear of the heat on my knees in the dirt, and I didn't think about anything except getting distance between her and the wagon before something in it let go. The powder did let go. About 40 yards out, when I was carrying her across the draw with her face turned into my chest and her arms not moving right. It went with a crack that sat in my ears for an hour afterward and sent a column of black smoke straight up into that flat blue Wyoming sky. I laid her down in the shade of a cut bank by the creek and got a look at her. The left side of her neck and her left forearm were the worst of it. Not charred, she'd been lucky in that one way, but red and already rising in that sick, watery way that means deep. The right side of her face had a scrape from cheekbone to jaw that was bleeding steadily into her hair. She was conscious. Barely. Her eyes were open and tracking me, and that was the whole of it. I said, "I'm going to get water." She didn't answer. I said, "You stay with me." She blinked once, like she understood and like she was too used up to do anything more than that. I had the canteen and I had the salve. I had a clean shirt rolled in my bedroll, which I tore into lengths. I worked slow. Cold water first on the burns. You keep it cool. You keep drawing the heat out. You don't slap grease on a hot wound or you're sealing the damage in. I'd learned that the hard way on a branding accident when I was 19, and the lesson had never left me. So I wetted the cloth and I laid it on her arm and her neck, and I changed it when it warmed, and I kept doing that while she lay there breathing through her nose in shallow pulls that told me the pain was considerable. She said after a long while, "Is he dead?" I said yes. She said, "My husband." I said, "Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry." She closed her eyes. Something moved across her face that I didn't try to name. When she opened them again, they were dry. That told me something about who she was. Her name was Nora Alt. I learned that in pieces over the rest of that day as she came around enough to speak in short bursts and then not speak for a while and then try again. She and her husband Clement had been 3 weeks out of Missouri, headed for the Oregon country, traveling alone because they'd fallen behind their party after a lame ox outside of Fort Kearny. The men who'd hit them had come up fast from the south, 3 of them, she thought, maybe 4. Clement had gone for the rifle and hadn't gotten to it. She'd run for the creek, and a spark from the cookfire they'd knocked over had taken the canvas before anyone meant it to. I said, "You didn't see which direction they rode." She said, "North toward the breaks." I said, "All right." She looked at me. Long enough that I glanced up from what I was doing with the cloth. She said, "Are you going after them?" I said, "Not while you're bleeding." She held my eyes for a second, then she looked away. "My name is Cal Rourke. I was 56 years old that summer, and I had spent most of those years working other men's cattle across ground that nobody else wanted to be on in weather that didn't care whether you lived or didn't. I'd had a wife once, back in Texas, a long time before all this. She died of a fever in our 3rd year, and I'd gone north because staying in the same place felt like standing on her grave. I hadn't meant to still be alone at 56. It had just turned out that way. I am not a man who talks about himself. What I've just told you I didn't say to Nora Alt that day, not any of it. What she knew about me in those first hours was my name, and that I knew how to handle a burn wound, which was enough for what needed doing. The mare was good. I'd had her 7 years and she ground-tied without fussing while I worked, and she let me use her as a windbreak when the evening came up cold off the creek. I built a small fire well back under the cut bank where it wouldn't carry, and I made coffee, and I heated a little of the salt pork I had, and I brought it to her on the flat of my knife blade, and she ate it sitting up, which was a better sign than anything else so far. She said, "I don't know your name." I said, "Cal Rourke." She said, "Mr. Rourke." She said it like she was testing the weight of it. "Then I have nothing. You understand that, whatever was in that wagon." I said, "You don't owe me." She said, "I'm not talking about owing. I'm talking about being honest with you about my situation." I looked at her. The firelight was on the left side of her face, and I could see how the burns had already started to change color at the edges, which was right. That meant the skin was doing what it was supposed to do. I said, "Your situation right now is that you're alive. That's the beginning of the accounting, not the end of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are a plain-spoken man." I said, "I am." She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it on account of the scrape on her cheek, but I could see where it was headed. That night I sat up and she slept. I'd done that before with hurt cattle, with injured horses, with one young hand on a drive outside of Cheyenne who'd gone under a horse and come up broken in 3 ribs and a collarbone, sat up through the dark, and watched for fever and watched for the breathing to change, and kept the fire at just enough. A man alone on a watch like that has a lot of time with his own company, and I will tell you that my company has not always been easy to keep. I had left too many things behind me and carried too many things I hadn't meant to. But that night, I was not thinking about any of that. I was watching her chest rise and fall and listening to the creek and keeping the fire. Toward 3 in the morning, she stirred, and I moved to her, and she was hot. Not bad, not the kind of hot that means you're losing the fight, but hot enough that I uncorked the canteen and got the wet cloth back on her arm and her neck and sat with my hand on her forehead until she settled again. She woke up enough to know I was there. She put her right hand over mine on her forehead, didn't say anything, just held it there for a moment, and then she went back under. I stayed where I was. I don't know how long enough for the fire to drop to coals and the stars to shift a quarter turn. Her hand had fallen away, and she was breathing easy, and the heat in her skin had backed off to something reasonable. I went and put 2 sticks on the coals and went back to the log I'd been using for a seat, and I thought about what came next. What came next was not simple. The nearest settlement with anything like a doctor was Bridger Station, which was the better part of a day's ride north and east. I had 1 horse. She could not walk that distance in her condition, not the burns alone, but the shock that comes after a burning, the way a body keeps the damage going for days whether you can see it or not. I knew that, too. I went to sleep sitting up against the cut bank for 2 hours around dawn and woke when the birds started, and the light went gray-pink in the east over the flats. She was watching me. I said, "How do you feel?" She said, "Like I was hauled out of a burning wagon." I said, "You were." She said, "The burns hurt less this morning." I said, "That's the salve working. It'll hold." She pushed herself up to sitting and looked at her arm, at the white cloth wrapped around the forearm and up over the bend of the elbow. She touched the edge of it carefully with 1 finger and then left it alone. She looked at the creek and at the open country beyond it, and at what was left of the wagon, which was just a black scatter and the iron fittings standing in the char. She said, "He wasn't a bad man." I said, "I didn't think he was." She said, "He was just not very good at being in country like this. He thought it would be more like Illinois. He thought if you worked hard enough it would be like anywhere else." I didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything right to say. She said, "I knew better. I grew up on the Platte. My father had a trading post there for 11 years. I knew what this country was, and I came anyway because..." She stopped. She said, "It doesn't matter." I said, "Did you want to go to Oregon?" She looked at me. She said, "I wanted to go somewhere that wasn't what the last 5 years had been." I understood that. I didn't say so. I cooked the rest of the salt pork and the last of my cornmeal into something flat and dense, and we ate it. And I boiled the coffee down strong, and we drank that, and I broke camp in the way I always do, fire cold, no trace, packed tight, while she sat on the log and watched me work. She said, "You're very efficient." I said, "Been doing it a long time." She said, "How long have you been out here?" I said, since I was about 20. She said, that's a long time to be on your own. I didn't answer that right away. I rolled the bedroll and tied it off and laid it across the mare's back before I said, it is. She said, do you like it? I thought about it. I said, I liked it more when I was 30. She looked at the creek for a while. She said, what's at Bridger Station? I said, a doctor, a few families, store. She said, and after that? I said, that's up to you. She said, I have no money. I have no people within 600 miles. I have the clothes I'm standing in and the shoes on my feet. I said, you have 2 good hands and a working head. I've seen men start on less. She said, women too. I said, especially women. She looked at me then, really looked, the way a person looks when they're trying to read something off your face and make up their mind about something. I kept my hands busy with the girth strap and let her look. She said, you're not afraid of me, are you? Most men get uncomfortable when a woman is too direct. I said, most men haven't spent much time talking to women who grew up on the Platte. She laughed, short and real, a little surprised out of her, and then she winced because the laugh had moved the skin on her neck. But she was still almost smiling when she stopped. I said, can you ride? She said, yes. I said, you'll take the saddle. I'll walk a spell and spell the mare, then we'll switch. She said, that will take all day. I said, then it'll take all day. She stood up carefully and I brought the mare to her and I cupped my hands for her boot, and she went up easy despite the arm. She had good horsemanship. I could see that from the way she settled into the saddle and found the stirrups without fussing. She was a tall woman, which I hadn't quite registered while she was lying down. Long-boned, like people who do physical work from childhood. Her hair had come loose on one side and the light was coming over the flats now and it caught the red in it. I said, ready. She said, Mr. Rourke, before we go. I looked up at her. She said, you sat up all night. I said, I sleep light anyway. She said, you changed the cloths 3 times in the night. I wasn't as asleep as you thought I was. I said, the fever needed watching. She said, yes. She paused. She said, I am not a woman who cries easily, so I'm not going to cry now. But I want you to understand that I know what you did, and I know that most men would have left me in that draw and ridden on. I said, I'm not most men. She said, no. She said it quiet, like she was making a note of it to herself, something to hold on to. No, you're not. We went north. I walked beside her in the first hour because the mare was doing enough with one rider and the uneven ground, and after a while I stopped thinking about the distance and just walked. The land was wide and almost still, a hawk working the thermals far to the east, a smell of sage after the dew burned off, the creek noise fading behind us. She rode without talking much, which I appreciated. Some people need to fill silence, and some people understand what silence is for. She was the second kind. At midday, I stopped her in the shade of a lone cottonwood by a stock pond, and I got the salve out and changed the dressings on her arm and her neck. She sat on a flat rock and held still while I worked, and I could feel her watching my hands. She said, where did you learn to do this? I said, my mother, and a Pawnee woman I rode with for a season when I was young. She said, rode with. I said, scouted for the same outfit. She knew plants, medicines, I picked up what I could. She said, that's unusual. I said, she was an unusual woman. She said, most men of your generation wouldn't have learned anything from a Pawnee woman. I said, most men of my generation didn't know what they were missing. She was quiet while I tied off the last strip of cloth. Then she said, do you think it will scar? I said, the neck a little. The arm, I don't know yet, probably less than you're thinking. She looked at her arm. She said, I don't care very much about scars. I believed her. I took the saddle for 2 hours after that. She'd argued, and I'd said 3 words and she'd stopped arguing, because she was sensible enough to know her strength had limits. I walked beside the mare while she rode, and we talked a little and didn't talk a little, and the miles came off the way miles do when you're not fighting them. What she told me in those walking miles, she had grown up the second daughter of a trading post man named Aldrich on the North Platte. Her mother had died when she was 9, and she'd run that post at her father's side from the time she was old enough to make change and haul freight. She could shoe a horse, she said, not as well as a farrier, but well enough. She could gut a deer, pull a calf, red weather off a cloud bank, preserve meat, drive a team, set a splint. Clement Alt had come through in the fall of her 29th year, and had seemed like a kind man, and she had been tired of waiting. She didn't say it with self-pity. She said it the way you say a fact. I told her because it seemed fair. I had a wife in Texas, 17 years ago now. She said, what was her name? I said, June. She said, what was she like? I said, bright, impatient, made the best cornbread I've ever eaten and refused to make it more than once a month because she thought it would spoil us. Nora laughed again, softer this time, no wince. I said she would have liked this country. She always wanted to go north. Nora said, why didn't you take her? I said, she died before I got the nerve together. She didn't say she was sorry. She just nodded and let it sit there, which was the right thing. Bridger Station came up in the late afternoon. A huddle of raw lumber buildings and a corral, and the thin curl of smoke from a stovepipe that meant someone was in and working. I walked her in on the mare, and the station man, a fellow named Garrett who I'd stopped through before, came out of the store and looked at us. I said, she needs the doctor. He said, Harlow's out at the Medina place, won't be back till tomorrow. I said, she's got burns on the arm and neck, been properly dressed, fever broke last night. She needs rest and a bed, and she needs someone to look at those dressings tomorrow. Garrett looked at Nora and then at me and said, who is she? I said, her name is Nora Alt. Her husband was killed by raiders 2 days south in the Laramie Draw. She needs a bed. Garrett's wife had come to the doorway and she said, bring her in. I helped Nora down from the mare and she stood in the dust of the station yard and put her hand on my arm for a moment to steady herself and then stood on her own. She looked at the buildings, at the sky, at the open country behind us. She looked like a woman doing arithmetic in her head. She said, will you stay? I said, tonight. She said, and then? I said, I usually winter over in the Sweetwater Valley. There's a man there who owes me a season's work and I've been putting off collecting it. She said, that's a long way. I said, it is. She said, Mr. Rourke. I looked at her. She said, I don't know what comes next. I won't pretend I do, but I know that I would like to know where you end up. I said, I generally stay at the Morrison Ranch. They know me there. She said, the Morrison Ranch in the Sweetwater. I said, that's right. She held my eyes. The sun was low and the light was going gold and amber across the flats, and it caught her face and the burns on her neck and the scrape on her cheek and all of it, and she looked at me like she was deciding something and had already decided it. She said, then I know where to find you. I said, I suppose you do. Garrett's wife came across the yard and put her arm around Nora's shoulder and steered her toward the door, and Nora went, but she looked back once. Just once. The look she gave me was plain, and it was warm, and it said something that neither one of us was going to put into words out there in a muddy station yard in front of Garrett and his wife, but I understood it all the same. I understood it the way you understand a fire after a cold ride, not by thinking about it, but by feeling the heat against your face and knowing you are not cold anymore. I unsaddled the mare and brushed her down and put her in the corral and fed her the last of the grain from my bag. I washed my hands at the pump. I stood in the yard for a little while in the last of the light and looked south toward the draw where the wagon had burned, and I thought about Clement Alt and about the 3 men who'd gone north into the breaks and about the way things end without asking permission and begin the same way. Garrett fed me supper, boiled beef and biscuits and coffee, and I ate it at his table, and he told me the news from the trail, which outfits had come through, who was going where, what the weather had been doing up toward South Pass. I listened, and I answered when he asked me things, and I ate everything in front of me because I was hungry, and because after a stretch like the last 2 days you owe it to yourself. I slept in the barn, clean straw and the mare for company, and the cold coming in around the board walls just enough to make the blanket feel like something. I slept hard. In the morning I was up before full light, and I was at the pump washing up when I heard the door of the station house open. I thought it was Garrett. It was Nora. She had a clean cloth wrapped fresh on her arm. Someone had redressed it in the night, or she had done it herself. And her hair was back, and she had a cup of coffee in her right hand, and she crossed the yard in the gray morning light and handed it to me without saying anything. I took it. She stood beside me at the pump, and we looked east where the sky was going pink over the flats, and the first birds were starting up in the willows by the creek. The burns on her neck were already beginning to look better. That was the pine and tallow and the cold water work doing what they were supposed to do. She would carry something from it, but less than it could have been. She said I slept. I said good. She said I haven't slept like that in months, maybe a year. I said your body needed to shut down and fix things. She said, is that what happened? I said that's part of it. She looked at me sideways. There was something in her face, not soft exactly, something more than soft, more particular than that. Like when a person has looked at something plain and ordinary for a long time, and then one morning they look at it again, and they see it differently, and they can't say what changed except that everything did. She said, you are a difficult man to know, but not a difficult man to trust. I didn't answer. She said, I find that is a rare combination. I said I wouldn't know. She said I would. The sun came up the way it does in that country, flat and fast and orange, burning the frost off the grass in the low places, making the creek flash. I drank the coffee she'd brought me, and she stood beside me, and we watched the day come in. Not talking. The two of us just standing in the station yard in the early morning with our shadows going long behind us and the country opening up ahead. I've thought about that morning a lot in the years since. Not the burning wagon, not the ride, not the raiders in the brakes. I thought about those things for a while and then I stopped. What I kept coming back to was that yard, the frost in the grass and the coffee going warm inside me and the sound of the willows and her standing there beside me just steady. Present, like she'd been there a long time, like she intended to go on being there. She wrote to the Morrison Ranch that November. I was still there when the letter came, which surprised me because I had half expected to be gone by then and I wasn't sure why I'd stayed. It was 2 pages in a clear, even hand. She had taken a position helping Garrett's wife through the winter, she said. She was saving. She had found the doctor and the dressings had come off and the scarring was less than expected. She thanked me for that, 2 sentences, plain and direct, no fuss about it. She said she had been thinking about the Sweetwater country. She said she had been thinking about a lot of things. I wrote back, 3 pages, which is more than I had written to anyone in about 15 years. The Morrison boy teased me about the length of it, and I told him to mind his business, and he grinned and went back to what he was doing. She came in the spring, rode in on a gray gelding she'd bought from a freighter passing through, and she sat that horse like she'd been born on one. Garrett had told her the road, and she'd come alone because she was the kind of woman who came alone when she decided to go somewhere. I was splitting wood in the yard when she rode in, and I put the axe down, and she swung off the gray, and we looked at each other across 20 feet of muddy April ground, and she said, "You didn't leave." I said I'd be here. She said, "Men say a lot of things." I said, "I know, I'm not most men." She walked across the yard and she put her right hand against the side of my face, the right hand, the one that hadn't been burned, and it was warm and steady, and she looked at me the way she had in that station yard in the last of the evening light, like she was reading something that was finally making sense, like she had been carrying something heavy a long way and had just set it down. I put my hand over hers. I didn't say anything, neither did she. The wood could wait. The day was soft and new, and the whole of the Sweetwater Valley was coming green in the morning light, and she was here and I was here, and whatever came next we would face it standing up. That was enough, that was more than enough. That was everything I had stopped letting myself want, handed to me plain in the mud of an April morning by a woman who had ridden 150 miles, because she'd decided I was worth the ride. I have never forgotten that, I never will,